For this President's Day week, I wanted to have a special episode, not on the typical President's Day week fare, like favorite president, best president, most important president. I want to talk about the most underrated president, a man named Herbert Hoover. In the popular imagination, Herbert Hoover is the laissez-faire Republican who got elected as the unsustainable boom of the 1920s was coming to an end. When the stock market crashed and the Great Depression happened, he sat on his hands and did nothing while the country descended into chaos. He's the guy whose presidency was so bad that people named every bad thing after him. So when shantytowns started going up on riverbanks and in parks, they were called Hoovervilles. People talked about Hoover leather, which was the cardboard people were using to cover the holes in the soles of their shoes because they couldn't afford to replace their shoes. Hoover blankets were the old newspapers that people pulled over themselves as they slept on park benches. He was widely panned for having said, "Prosperity is just around the corner," even as the country plunged into the worst economic crisis of its history. But Herbert Hoover wasn't a laissez-faire Republican. He didn't sit on his hands while the country plunged into crisis. And he didn't even say prosperity is just around the corner. Instead, he was actually a quite able administrator, actually a legendary administrator. He was a self-made man who had developed expertise not just in business, but in humanitarian relief. He was not heartless or cruel or indifferent. He didn't fail to make an effort. What he did fail to do was to understand the magnitude of the crisis that he was facing. And he failed to fix the Great Depression. But as we're going to talk about in this episode, he wasn't as much a victim of stupidity as he was a victim of bad timing. So let's just do a quick capsule history of who Herbert Hoover was. He, first of all, was a Quaker and was orphaned at a young age, was farmed out, as often happened in those days, to live with family all over the country, first in Iowa and then eventually on the West Coast. He made his way through the prior worst financial crisis of American history in the 1890s, somehow managed to get himself into Stanford, even though he wasn't quite prepared, impressed his teachers so much that he managed to get recommended for a job for which he was not really qualified after he took his geology degree. Ended up in Australia running a mining company, was doing jobs that were meant for men who were a decade older than him very soon, and became a self-made millionaire in the mining business. Eventually, he got tired of just making money. He decided it wasn't enough. He had been running and running and running for the first few decades of his life. And now he wanted to give something back. And that happened just as World War I breaks out. So Herbert Hoover ends up going to Belgium to organize food relief because after the Germans invaded and the entire country turns into a massive battlefield, people were at great risk of starvation. He did all of the logistics of moving American relief aid into Europe and getting it distributed to people. He probably saved millions of lives. He recruits an army of women to go door to door and try to persuade other women to adopt meatless and wheatless days in order to preserve food for the troops abroad. He was so successful at this that people called observing these voluntary rationing days Hooverizing. So coming out of World War I, here is a description from his biographer, Walter Leutenberg, who was actually fairly critical of Hoover. He has written one of the, well done, but more hostile biographies of him. But here's his description of what Hoover was doing after World War I, after he's finished with food relief. As vice chairman of the Second Industrial Conference that convened in December 1919, Hoover advocated a Department of Public Works, a federal employment service, a home loan banks. After the meetings ended in 1920, he was the chief author of a report to the president recommending a minimum wage, a 48-hour work week, the eradication of child labor, improved housing, and equal pay for men and women. Does that sound like a laissez-faire Republican to you? Certainly didn't sound like one for the era. So This man is so well known and so well admired that both parties are competing to have him run for them. And he eventually decides that he wants to run as a Republican. He's historically Republican. He's from the Midwest. And so he associates himself with the Republican Party, but parties in part were much looser coalitions. They were much less ideological than regional. And they contained multitudes, as it were. So Hoover goes into the Republican Party and he ends up appointed Commerce Secretary. During his time as Commerce Secretary, he's actually massively expanding the role of government, and also not just expanding it. He is increasing its regulatory capacity, its ability to see what's happening in the economy and also to react to that. So for one thing, he is advancing the use of government statistics. He sets up a bureau to keep track of commerce. He desegregates the Census Bureau, which was a fairly big and fairly controversial decision. He sets up regulation of radio and aviation, which at the time, we take it for granted that there's regulation of those things, but they're new emerging industries. He organizes the relief of the Great Mississippi Flood of 1927. He uses government soft power to push industry towards product standardization, which is, again, something that we take for granted now and that has since been reinforced with more government regulation. But at the time was actually a major innovation that allowed consumers to get a good sense of what they were buying from each manufacturer rather than trying to choose between all these different competing standards for things. He promotes the Colorado River Compact for water rights among Western states, and he persuades U.S. Steel to implement an 8-hour workday. Again, whatever you think of these developments, this is really not very laissez-faire. So why does Hoover get the reputation for being a hands-off president who didn't believe in the power of government? Well, for a lot of reasons. Number one is that people are comparing him to FDR, and this gets caught up in a lot of ideological fights about the value of the New Deal. People are so committed to either tearing down, but also mostly building up FDR, that they draw the contrast that indeed Democrats were drawing in the political campaign of 1932 between the muscular activity of FDR and the guy who preceded him. And look, this is a little bit fair. Hoover did not spend as much money as FDR. He did not have as many big programs. But he did, in fact, do more than he's often credited for in the kind of folk history of the Great Depression to try to alleviate it. And to the extent he didn't, I think you have to think about the constraints that were facing him. The biggest one is just we have something called hindsight bias, right? You know it was the Great Depression, but Herbert Hoover didn't know it was the Great Depression. What he saw initially was just a downturn in business that was not that different from previous downturns that we'd seen in, say, early 1920 after World War I ended and the economy sort of has to readjust itself back to a peacetime standard. So think back to COVID, right? At the beginning of COVID, think about how uncertain you were. I mean, think about how in February, there were some people who were panicking and you were saying, I really don't think this is going to be a big deal. Maybe not you, but a lot of people were saying that, right? And then think about going into COVID and all of the crazy things we did. Washing groceries was a common one among my friends, but I'm sure you can think of a bunch of them. Why? Because we were in a period of tremendous uncertainty. Something that almost never happens. A once-in-a-century pandemic had come, and because it is a once-in-a-century pandemic, none of us had ever lived through anything like it. And so we did a bunch of weird things, or we didn't react to the rising numbers out of China and then out of Italy, because we just didn't have any framework to analyze it with. And Herbert Hoover was in a similar place. What ended up happening with the Great Depression was so dramatic, it spanned the globe. And it mired the United States in stagnation for 10 years. And misery and double-digit unemployment. He had never seen anything like that. And of course, he wasn't expecting it when the first signs of the crash came. Exacerbating that was the fact that the state of economic data and of economic theory was incredibly primitive in 1929 and 1930. Again, we take for granted that we have this bevy of government agencies that produces every statistic you could practically want. We have data on unemployment. We have data on what our gross domestic product is. We have data on, what's happening with payrolls and with manufacturing and all sorts of other things. But that was in its infancy in the 1920s and 1930s. Partly because it's really resource intensive to, call all of those people, collate it all, publish the data. And America used to be a lot poorer. It's only as we start getting richer and as we start developing the economic theory to get a handle on what's happening in the economy that we start developing the resources that future presidents would use to see, and future Federal Reserve chairs, and future government bureaucrats, that those people would use to see what's happening in the economy. Herbert Hoover didn't even know what the unemployment rate was. He didn't understand how dire the problem was, and he certainly didn't understand how dire it was going to get. Because again, the state of economic theory was really in its infancy. Most weeks, I've got 3 podcasts, an editorial, and a column to write. I've also got 2 dogs and a husband who's just as busy as I am and who occasionally likes to eat dinner. So when 6 p.m. rolls around, again, always, every time, every day, I'm off it at my wit's end. I know a lot of you are in the same spot. Nothing really beats a home-cooked meal, but let's be honest, weeknights can make that feel impossible. That's why I've been loving HelloFresh lately. It takes the stress out of figuring out what to cook. And with over 100 recipes every week, there's always something new. Whether you want comfort food or something totally different, HelloFresh has you covered. They have more than 35 high-protein recipes each week, which I love, including new Mediterranean and GLP-1 friendly options. They have a cheesy smashed burger with Old Bay fries that looks absolutely incredible. Their Parmesan-crusted chicken cutlet was as delicious as it sounds, and it was on the table 30 minutes after I opened the fridge. The meals are simple, actually taste great, and the portions are big enough that everyone leaves the table full. It makes cooking at home feel easy again, even on the busiest nights. Because when dinner tastes this good, nothing hits like home cooking. So go to hellofresh.com/optimistic10fm to get 10 free meals and a freeze-willing knife, $144.99 value, on your 3rd box. Offer valid while supplies last, and the free meals will be applied as a discount on the first box. New subscribers only, varies by plan. What's happening in America during the Great Depression, there is a lot of deflation and a sharp contraction of credit. So deflation is just the opposite of inflation. It is a broad decrease in the general price level. And that usually sounds good to people who would not be against prices going down. In fact, this is a big fight that we're having today. People were mad at Joe Biden because he didn't bring prices down, even though the rate of inflation was trending downwards for most of his presidential term. And people are now mad at President Trump because he hasn't brought prices down either. But economists think that deflation is bad. And then there's also what happens in the labor market. So wages are what economists call sticky. And what does sticky mean? It means they tend to stick where they are. So when you have deflation, that problem gets worse, right? Because if I keep your wages exactly where they were, the real value of what I'm paying you actually goes up. It's the opposite of inflation. When in inflation, as too many of us recently discovered, when your wages stay steady and inflation is rising, the real value of what you're getting paid is going down. But this effectively, at a time of economic contraction, which is usually when you see broad deflations, actually pushes wage bills up relative to what the companies are taking in revenue. And that leads to a lot of unemployment. And so all of those forces are converging on the economy in 1930. And Hoover is facing a huge problem. From the fall of 1930 through the winter of 1933, the money supply of the U.S. contracted by nearly 30%. And a lot of that is due to the gold standard. So let's talk a little bit about gold and what a gold standard is. I mean, there are variations on a theme, but in its broadest sense, the gold standard means my currency is worth gold. I can take my dollar to the treasury and get, in exchange for your dollar, a fixed sum of gold. They're convertible, in other words. The price of a dollar is fixed at a certain amount of gold. Now, a lot of people like the idea of this because it makes it, in theory, very hard for the federal government to inflate the currency. But the gold standard created a bunch of problems. Number one, it makes the monetary supply less flexible than it should be. You don't have the ability to expand in a crisis and support the economy. But it also means that, look, imagine you're a foreigner and you have a dollar, which you can turn into gold if you want to. And you start to get worried about, doesn't have to be America, it could be any country. If you get worried about their economy, you take this gold standard currency and you go and you get the gold and you move it. And this actually happened in the United States. And at first, it actually meant that we got a big inflow of gold early in the Great Depression because people were worried about other countries. But when that happens, central bankers, because again, it's got to be a one-to-one conversion, and they don't want to lose all of their gold reserves, which back in the day were literally their currency reserves sitting in big vaults. Central bankers then moved to protect the integrity of that supply by raising interest rates. Now, in some economic theory, this makes sense, right? The problem is, if people are worried about your economy because your economy is contracting, and you raise interest rates, your economy contracts still more. And that dynamic was happening not just in the United States, it was happening all over the place in the early 1930s. This is really bad for an economy, a banking system, and frankly, an international order that's already in big trouble. So again, I want to go back to that folk history of the Great Depression where the stock market crashes and then the economy goes to hell and all the banks fail and Herbert Hoover just sits there. But you should understand that one reason that Hoover did not take as bold action as people think he should have is that he kept getting signs that maybe we'd turn the corner. Now, today, we don't wait to turn the corner. The first sign that we're in a recession, the government swoops in and takes pretty aggressive action, more aggressive since the global financial crisis, as we saw during the pandemic. And we can argue about whether that's a good or a bad approach, but it just wasn't common before the 1930s, in part because, as I say, we really underestimate the fact that as we got richer, we just had more surplus for governments to do these kinds of maneuvers with. When most people are living on subsistence or near subsistence agriculture, there are just limits to how much you can have the government intervene. And also there's limits on the state capacity, the bureaucratic expertise needed to do those kinds of interventions. Because as I say, again, we didn't even know what the unemployment rate actually was when Hoover was president. So he thinks that he's got this thing, like this happens actually several times during his presidency where there are green shoots. And because he doesn't have very good visibility into the economy, he thinks that he's licked it and it's safe to do something modest. And I think here is where we should talk about what Hoover isn't good at. And one thing he is not good at is working with Congress. He is a technocrat at heart. He's a little bit aloof. He thinks everything should be, he's a little bit of a brain in a vat, you might say. People who met him all his life would talk about how he seemed unhumorous and boring and gruff and blunt and thoroughly lacking in charm. And I think that this ultimately is one reason that he gets such a bad rap from history, because FDR is the opposite of this. Hoover is, I think of him as a print guy in a radio age, right? When the president, before Hoover, being a great stump politician just matters a lot less because most people are never going to see you give a speech. They're going to read your speeches in a newspaper, and that puts a premium on a completely different kind of politician. FDR was a master of using radio, right? The famous fireside chats. he has mastered this new medium in the same way that television changed presidential races in the 1960s. And, there's the famous argument, possibly apocryphal, but that Nixon versus Kennedy, the debate in 1960, that John F. Kennedy lost that debate, according to people who listened to it on the radio, but won it according to people who watched him on television. Because Nixon was sweating under the hot lights and looked haggard, and JFK looked like cool and handsome and young and energetic. FDR figured out how to use radio to reach people. But that wasn't a skill that the presidency had required in the same way before radio came along. So ironically, if we go back to the fact that Herbert Hoover starts radio regulation, he contributed in a small way to his own demise. But I don't think any of it would have changed his political fortunes. Ultimately, he was doomed the minute the Great Depression started, politically. But let's talk about what he did do as he's trying to do this. As the Depression deepens, and as it becomes clear that this is not a temporary or a small thing, Hoover actually does the one thing that was probably the most important, or at least attempts the one thing that was probably most important to resolving the Great Depression, and that is fixing the banking system. The reason you want to fix the banking system is people. The banking system is where money is ultimately created. This sounds a little weird to non-economists, but basically what happens is the way the Federal Reserve works is it pushes reserves into banks, and then the banks lend that money out into the economy. When banks aren't doing that, when they're pulling back, when they're foreclosing, when they're failing and taking people's life savings with them, that contracts the economy. And so the most important thing for Hoover was figuring out a way to get the bank failures to stop. You can argue about whether his solution was working. Certainly some of the things he did were good. They were about improving the stability of banks, creating credit. But he also does a $2 billion public works bill in 1932. And to be clear, at the time, that's about a third of the entire federal budget. The problem is it's funded by massive tax hikes. Now, not tax hikes on ordinary people, most of whom do not pay very much in income tax during the 1930s. He raises corporate taxes. He raises estate taxes. He raises personal income taxes. The top income tax rate was 63% for anyone who is, I think that should put the laissez-faire Republican trope to bed. But so Herbert Hoover wants to do this big public works push in order to put people back in work. And that is probably a good idea. But when he is taxing people to pay for that, well, when people are paying those taxes, they're taking money out of whatever it was doing, and they are instead giving it to you. And so whatever they were buying with that money before, they're now not buying. And so you don't get the same net effect as you would if the government were funding it with borrowed money. So could Hoover have done better? Absolutely. But could Hoover have done better with the tools he had available to him? I think that's a more complicated question. For one thing, Hoover wasn't as inactive as history remembers. And the thing is, it didn't matter for his political fortunes or for how he's remembered, because he'd have lost office and been blamed regardless. The fact is that presidents get unfair credit when the economy is good, and they get unfair blame when it's bad. And partisans on both sides always attribute the successes of the good things that happen under the presidents from their party to that president, and then shucks, it's just bad luck that some bad things happen too. But I want to convince you that in fact the president just doesn't have that much control over the economy. And if you think about it, that's a good thing. It would be bad if the president was the only thing standing between us and economic disaster or us and an economic boom. It would mean that every election we could make ourselves bankrupt, or I guess transport ourselves to paradise. But in fact, the president just doesn't have that much control over the economy. If he did, if she did, we hope someday, that would actually make us all incredibly vulnerable because policy would swing back and forth. Most of the economy is not about politics. It is individual people making individual decisions in their day-to-day lives to make things, to buy things, to grow things, to invest, to start a business, to do all of the other million things that go into economic activity. I'm not saying that the president doesn't matter at all. So if you look at Donald Trump's tariffs, which everyone likes to argue about, and the thing that the supporters of the tariff say is, well, you said it would be a disaster, and look, jobs are still okay, the economy is still growing, where's the disaster you promised me? And in truth, I both think the tariffs were a bad idea and have hurt the economy. And I think that a lot of people who were talking about the tariffs and were opposed to them kind of overpromised on the level of catastrophe. It has had a lot of effects on various industries and on various consumer purchases, but it has not plunged us into the eternal dark night of poverty. And it's not going to, because any one decision like that has an overall fairly small impact on the economy. What really mattered for Herbert Hoover was timing. FDR had the benefit of hindsight. He came in knowing how bad things were. He also came in when things were probably just about bottoming out, naturally. The economy could not actually free fall forever. At some point, you get back to very basic things, and things do bottom out slowly, fitfully, and they start growing again. FDR comes in at a time where, first of all, he knows that the Great Depression is the worst thing America has lived through economically in its modern history. Second of all, he has a much bigger political constituency, including a landslide in Congress, for taking bold action. But the third thing to keep in mind is that regardless of what you think of his policies, and of course, I haven't even mentioned most of the fan favorites like Social Security, but regardless of what you think of those policies, you kind of have to admit they didn't actually end the Great Depression. So I want to run through a few numbers with you. So if you look at Hoover, he comes in and the unemployment rate is functionally zero. It's very close to zero, in part because, remember, people were poorer then, so they didn't have the ability to say, like, I'm going to take a while and look around and find a job I want. They really had to be working all the time. But the unemployment rate spikes from well under 5% all the way up to a quarter of the population in 1932. Now, FDR comes in, the unemployment rate by 1934 has fallen is still above 20%. By 1936, it's above 20%. It then starts consistently falling, bottoms out in 1937, and then spikes again and is back to 20% in 1938. Why? Well, I mean, we can argue about the causes, but I think the point I'm trying to make here is that for all of that activity, there is still immense suffering happening. FDR, many of the things he did, like the Works Progress Administration, the things that people really remember and lionize him for, undoubtedly many of those things helped alleviate the misery that people were experiencing. But they did not, in fact, turn around the economy. What turned around the economy was World War II. And until then, FDR, like Hoover, was struggling. It just takes time. It takes time for fiscal and monetary stimulus to move into the economy. It takes time for the real imbalances that had led to the contraction to work themselves out. I'm not here to have arguments about how much stimulus is right. My argument is simpler than that. It's that we should pay attention to who our presidents are, obviously. There are lots of ways in which our presidents matter, and we should pay attention to what they do economically. There is better economic policy and worse economic policy. But we should not treat them as the reason that the economy happens. The economy is outside of the president's control. He is very limited. He or she have very limited levers to change economic outcomes. They can and should do things to improve around the edges. And especially when you're dealing with an unprecedented crisis, they're going to have to be creative. I think you can fault Herbert Hoover for not understanding what he was facing and for not being creative soon enough. Although I think that by 1932, really is actually kind of tapping into his inner super administrator. But you shouldn't fault him for not being able to fix the Great Depression by himself. As we've seen, FDR couldn't do that either. You shouldn't fault him for having failed to see in 1929 that the country was on, or even in 1930, possibly even in 1931, what the country was in for. Because for the same reason that you don't fault people for not knowing in everything that you now know about the COVID pandemic in March of 2020, or indeed in March of 2021. There's only so much you can do when you're faced with something novel. You're going to make a lot of mistakes. Hoover did make a bunch of mistakes, and in some ways he was not a man well suited to what the office was demanding at that time. But it's hard to say what history would have looked like if Al Smith, the Democratic candidate in 1928, had won, and Herbert Hoover had run against him in 1932. Would we now think of him as the great administrator, the impeccable humanitarian who came into office and saved America from the depredations of the Democrats? It seems quite possible that we might have. Because, well, a president can go a long way with hard work and with humanitarian instincts. In the end, luck comes for us all. This has been another episode of Reasonably Optimistic Podcast. Please follow us on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you enjoyed this episode, please like and subscribe. And I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Do you think I'm right about Herbert Hoover? Do you think I'm wildly wrong? And do you have another candidate for your most underrated president in this President's Day week? Hope to hear from you. Until next time.